I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and it is my great good fortune to be sharing an airwave or airwaves. How do we even do this when we're on the internet? With Edmund White, the one and only, and Garth Greenwell. And we are here not only because these are two of the most fun writers I can think of to hang out on a Friday afternoon with. There's a new edition of Ed's second novel from 1978. Nocturnes for the King of Naples. And it's a reissue. It's a trade paperback. If you have not read this book, I cannot say enough times, please go read it. Garth has written a foreword to this new edition. So, like I said, kind of an excuse to hang out with two very smart guys. Ed, I'm going to ask you to say hello so if your listeners can hear your voice.
Hey, everybody. You should buy the book just to read Garth's introduction.
Well, there's that. And Garth, I'm going to ask you to say hi, too, so that everyone can hear your voice as well.
Hi, everyone. You should buy the book because Edmund wrote a beautiful novel back in 1978.
Right. And I'm going to follow up both of the men and say, no, really, just buy the book. It's brilliant. And it is gorgeous and really dreamy and I'm not sure what I expected because obviously I've been reading you for more than a minute, as I explained before we hit the record button for this episode of the show. But stylistically, it's a little different.
Oh, yeah. My first two books were avant-garde, and then Boys on Story was a switch toward realism.
Okay. I want to go back to Garth for a second. Garth, do you remember, when did you first read Nocturnes?
I think I first read it when I was an undergraduate, when I first read Edmund White when I was in high school. I read A Boy's Own Story, and then I also read a book that really has a very big place sort of in my intellectual life, which is a collection of Ed's essays called The Burning Library. And then as an undergraduate, I think I read pretty much everything. But then I had not read it again either until I started thinking about this year, 1978, a lot, because it was kind of an important year in gay literature. And that sent me back to Nocturnes.
Okay, so Garth, I'm going to ask you to put in that context for 1978 because I'm pretty sure I know what you're referring to. But, Ed has a couple of minutes on you in the grand scheme of things. So I want you to bring sort of younger folks in. And then, Ed, we're coming back to you because I'm pretty sure I know what 1978 meant for you. But let's start with Garth.
Yeah, well, I mean, Edmund is the authority here. He lived through it, whereas 1978 is actually the year of my birth. But it's also a kind of an annus mirabilis, I say this in my foreword, for gay literature in North America. Several gay books were published in 1978. I think, Ed, somewhere you talk about this, the fact that there were 5 or 6 big gay novels. Two of those novels entered the canon. One of them, I think, is a classic, a real masterpiece of American literature, which is Andrew Halloran's Dancer from the Dance. And the other book, which I think is really interesting and important, but is not a book I love, is Larry Kramer's Faggot. And it's interesting to me that, with Edmund's next book, A Boy's Own Story, which I think was 1983, something like that. Edmund wrote his sort of pillar of modern gay literature, and that book entered the canon. But Nocturnes kind of got a little lost. And that's really interesting to me to think about why this book has been so neglected.
So, Edmund, do you remember when you started writing Nocturnes and sort of where, because you had a writing group in New York. This is before, when did you get to Paris?
Paris was not until later in the 80s.
Okay, that's what I thought. So you're still in New York. You've got a writing group. Halloran, actually the author of Dancer from the Dance, is part of your writing group. But the literary landscape is very, very different as you're sitting down to write Nocturnes from the King of Naples.
It's strange to say, but I kind of believed my own reviews because everybody had said that my first novel, Forgetting Elena, was so avant-garde and so this and that. So I began to, I've never been able to express this, but I decided to write a book that would sound like the book that Forgetting Elena was supposed to be. I mean, it's so weird to say that, but, in other words, I believed that I really was an avant-garde writer, and And so I wrote this kind of dreamy, erotic, religious book that really was just had nothing to do with my first novel, except that it was my idea of what I had been doing, or at least reviewers had convinced me that's what I was doing. That sounds too weird.
No, it doesn't sound weird at all. It sounds beautiful because the thing is, Nocturnes is so dreamy and sort of elliptical, and we don't know exactly where we are necessarily. Like, if you know New York in 1978, you have kind of a framework, but I think that you can get lost in this tiny little book just in the sentences alone and the characters and the voice and little details like fashion and art and food and who's sort of swirling. It feels a little French, this novel. It feels a little French. It feels like I'm reading something. And yes, I know you lived in Paris for a while, but it feels like almost as if I'm reading something translated
Oh, that's
from French
interesting.
into English. And French is a very pretty language, and they do some really interesting things. And you have a track with Genet and Proust, and we will come to that at some point. But it feels very sort of, yeah, European and timeless.
Well, thank you. I actually don't know very many books that are like it in English. Maybe did Judna Barnes' book a little bit.
Edmund, you said something years ago, quoting Joseph Conrad, where you said, fiction really is a visual medium. And I can't believe I'm bringing Joseph Conrad into this conversation, but I am because I really like this line. And I think it's really true of Nocturnes. I felt like I was sort of walking through a very sort of 70s kind of film. I wouldn't have picked 78 as the year, but Barry Lyndon and things like that, all of those kind of very dreamy movies where you're not quite sure what's happening, but wow, the sets are kind of amazing.
Right.
And you're watching something shot on film and not digital. That's
I think I had some theory at the time uh, that I called, but it probably doesn't make sense. Phenomenology. That is, I thought of you would try to create events like, let's say you walk into a room and you don't know what you think your feet are cold, but they're actually wet. That is an actual moment in this book where in the first chapter, or he'll see light bouncing off something very far away that, and he interprets the signal in the wrong way. And I mean, there's this kind of constant confusion about what sensory experience really is. It takes the rational mind to try to rectify it and interpret it.
Garth, I want to use that to build off of something that you said elsewhere, where you're talking about how art is a way for us to understand how we feel about our place in the world. And I mean, right there, I think Edmund has summed up quite a lot of where I'm trying to go with this. But for you, do you remember how you felt the first time you read Nocturnes versus how you felt reading it again? A little more mileage on you.
Yeah, I think I don't have a super vivid memory of reading it as an undergraduate. And I think I was probably really ill equipped to read it. And I suspect that I felt pretty lost. And, one of the things that I wanted to do in the little foreword that I wrote was sort of give a kind of map, like really sort of try to give some resources for a reader. Because actually, so, I mean, one of the ways that the book works, like Edmund talks about phenomenology, there's very vivid sense data. There are these images that leap off the page. And yet, the sort of narrative tissue that usually in novels sort of gives context for that sense data is often really loose or sort of dreamy. I mean, the book is called Nocturnes. And as in a nocturne, you have these sort of very vivid kind of harmonies that don't fit into the usual harmonic structure. So you don't really know where you are. But there is that structure, like actually, and coming back to it, yeah, as you say, sort of having read, because I mean, I wasn't even a literature major, I was a musician. And so it was easy for me to enjoy this book, but not easy for me to sort of feel like I had understood this book. But coming to it now, it is easy to see that actually, I mean, Edmund, in a way that I think is very canny and brilliant, like there is actually a very sturdy architecture sort of here. And there is a narrative that if you're attentive, you can figure out. And it's actually very pleasurable to figure it out. But it's also pleasurable to just sort of relax and go with it and drift as you would in a dream. So kind of you can't go wrong, really.
One of the things I thought of when I was writing it was that I imagined going through somebody's garbage and finding all of their love letters, but you don't know them, you don't know what happened, but you know something important, maybe even tragic, happened. But and this is sort of the top of the iceberg about it, but you don't really know what concretely happened, and it's just all suggestion and nuance, but not really anything substantial.
But that's what I really liked about it. So I read it twice, kind of in quick succession. Once without knowing anything about it and just simply for language and simply because it's you and Garth had written the foreword and whatnot. And I was like, okay, let's just dive in and say. And I liked being off kilter as I was reading. And Edmund, that's something you've always said about your work, that you've always wanted sort of your work to leave people a little discombobulated, which, having read A Boy's Own Story and having read The Beautiful Room is Empty, and those are sort of more classically straightforward narratives, right? Like the way you tell those stories, and you do borrow from your own history and whatnot to tell them. But this book, I'm completely in love with this book. Not that I'm not in love with the other books, but I am completely in love with this book in a way that I wasn't expecting it from you, and how it fits in. I mean, I've read the essays. I think about your Proust essay often. I have read your biography of Proust. I've even read most of the Genet biography. And I think you have a fondness for Genet that I may not share, but it was you writing on Genet, so I was like, I must read this.
Right. One time I was in Minneapolis giving a reading of short stories, and there was a girl in the audience who said, "Oh, I love what you do." And I said, "Tell me, what do I do?" And she said, "Well, you put a kind of weird emphasis on things that other people would see as details, and you sort of skip over the things that other people would see as key to the exposition."
But what if you're just letting us fill in the gaps?
Yeah, yeah. But I, I mean, that spoke to me when she told me that. I thought, you can really learn lots from audiences. Like, I remember in that same Minneapolis reading, they were all very sweet, kind of slightly intimidated Midwesterners, which I am too myself. And I said, now after this reading, if I got anything wrong, like because it was set in Minneapolis, uh, tell me. And they were very shy, but they said, well, you can't actually eat a loon, which is a kind of bird. It's too oily. And, they made about 10 important corrections. And I love that you can actually learn things from people.
Garth, what have you learned from readers? I mean, it seems to me that what belongs to you when it came out, I mean, the reviews were great. It's a wonderful book. And then Cleanness comes out, and a lot of people were a little surprised. And they kind of said, oh, hey, we know this guy can write, but the sex, can we talk about the sex for a second? And I feel like there was an evolution of you on the page. And there was what, 4 or 5 years between each book? 4, okay. But What Belongs to You is kind of very traditionally a novel. And there's also been a lot of conversation about Cleanness. Like, is it stories? Is it a novel? Is it a novel in stories? And you're playing with form in a way that I sort of feel like Edmund's playing with in Nocturnes.
Yeah, I think that that's true. I mean, there's a way that the chapters in Nocturnes don't function the way chapters function in like Dickens. I mean, they're not sort of plot punctuation. Instead, I mean, they're kind of set pieces or they're kind of fantasias, but there is a kind of autonomy between them. And I mean, again, like Ed gives us a label for them. He calls them Nocturnes. And I was very pleased with my publisher that they did not try to pressure me to call Cleanness either a novel or a book of short stories, but they wouldn't let me call it what I wanted to call it, which was a song cycle. Like I wanted to sort of say that this was like Schubert's Winterreise or something, a Lieder cycle. But yeah, there's a way that in some way I sometimes joke, and this isn't exactly true, but there was so much talk about the sex in What Belongs to You. Like there was all of this stuff about, oh, how courageous this sex writing, which I thought was just kind of ludicrous on one hand, because I thought these people need to read like Samuel Delany or, I mean, you need to read so, but also in What Belongs to You, there's almost no sex. I mean, I think there are maybe 2 pages of sex writing. And so I sometimes joke that in Cleanness, I wanted to earn all the conversation about sex that there had been in What Belongs to You. And
that's like my trying to be the avant-garde writer that the reviewers of Forgetting Elena had discerned, but that didn't exist.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there is a way that, and again, that's not exactly true because one of the big kind of sex chapters in Cleanness was written before and published actually before the book came out. But it is true that, I mean, you never want, or I'll speak for myself, I never want sort of discourse about my book to shape, how I write. I'll never forget kind of this question that I got in really sort of the first big interview I did for What Belongs to You, which was in England for the BBC. And this sort of very hostile interviewer with her very intimidating British accent said to me, why, after decades in which gay men's lives have been reduced to sex, would you start a novel in a cruising bathroom? And I remember just being so shocked because I thought, why in the world do you think that a sort of homophobic narrative about gay men should shape the book that I write? And so I never want, sort of criticism to affect me in that way. But then it's also true that there is kind of a little bit of a sort of FU, sort of like, I will write back against some response that seems to me ludicrous to my work. There is some of that.
But I think, too, if we look at the landscape of gay literature, right, like I remember David Leavitt and Edmund White putting sort of gay literature on the map for me as a kid in suburban Massachusetts, right, and just saying, oh, well, these are clearly people I should be reading. I'm pretty sure I had a remaindered copy of The Lost Language of Cranes and a remaindered copy of Boy's Own Story. And I mean, that's how we sort of figured out voice, right? Like, yeah, I'm trying to think of how the landscape has evolved, right? And all of that energy. And there were moments where, and it happens for, Asian American fiction and fiction by Black authors and whatnot. Like, you get pigeonholed for a minute, and then suddenly the landscape gets bigger and more people are coming to the work with their own feelings, right?
What happened with gay writing in 1978? The writing up till then, the gay writing was either just pornography, or if it was trying to be literary, it was addressed to a straight reader, so that you had to explain where Philon was and what it was. And but in 78, all of a sudden you could assume the reader was initiated and already knew all that stuff. And partly it was because suddenly there were gay bookstores and there were gay literary outlets like Christopher Street and different things that would it assumed there was a gay community, which you couldn't really assume before that.
Yeah, it does feel like the 70s. I mean, Edmund, you were at Stonewall
Right.
when the original, are we calling it an uprising? Because riots is not the right word. That's not, I mean, Los Angeles, we now say the Los Angeles uprising, not the riot. How do you prefer to describe Stonewall from
I think
1969?
riot sounds more fun, but
Okay, then we'll use riot. Then whatever you would like to use is what we're using. But you were there. You were there in this really pivotal moment in history, not just for gay New Yorkers and gay Americans, but like for us in the grander scheme of things. I mean, that was a really big moment that was unplanned, if I remember my history correctly, right?
oh yeah, and it seemed funny to us. I mean, I always say that it was the first funny revolution because when we would say gay is good, an imitation of black is beautiful, that seemed ludicrous to us, and we'd all burst into laughter. And then the Black Panthers were very much on the scene at that moment, and so we began to dance on Gay Street behind the cops who were on Christopher Street, and we called ourselves the Pink Panthers, and and there was a lot of humor. Partly what was funny was to be so daring as to place your little revolution in this great tradition of Black Revolution, Feminist Revolution, anti-Vietnam War. All those important movements had superseded the gay one, and so we thought, well, we're a little arrogant to try to place our little bastille into this landscape.
But don't we all build off of each other's experience? I mean, that's the very definition of intersectionality, right? Like we're all just coming together and building community on top of community. And Garth, you were a musician first. You mentioned that. Then poetry was your next thing. But in terms of being a kid from the American South who finds his community, I mean, books were probably a big part of that for you, right?
Yeah, they absolutely were. I mean, my sort of salvation as a gay kid in the pre-internet South was that at my independent bookstore in Louisville, Holly Cook, there was a like shadowy little corner in the back of what was then called gay and lesbian literature. And I would like pretty much randomly pull something off the shelf and, run away to another part of the store to read it. And that was how I discovered, I mean, actually, somebody really cared about that section because that's how I discovered James Baldwin and Jeanette Winterson and Mishima and Genet. And I read all this stuff not knowing anything about it, except that it was on this shelf. And therefore, I felt like it had something to say to me. And that was kind of a wonderful literary education. And it's because of writers like Edmund and Andrew Halloran and Larry Kramer and, a whole sort of generation of remarkable and brave writers that for me, like, it was never even a question, this idea that, generations of writers before me had to face of like, if I center my books on queer experience, is that going to be pushing me into the back court, into the shadowy corner of some bookstore? Is that going to be, it was very clear to me from the start, not just because of Edmund's novels, but also because of his championing of writers like Genet and Proust and sort of excavating a queer literary history, that like queer literature was right at the center of, this question of art and culture. And that, I feel immense gratitude to sort of those generations of gay writers who made that possible. Because it's the whole idea, which I did get the question a lot touring for What Belongs to You, like, do you think of yourself as a gay writer or don't you want to be a universal writer? And those questions just seemed absurd to me. It seemed absolutely absurd to suggest that being a gay writer meant that somehow one was limiting oneself. Of course not. Proust isn't limited. Baldwin isn't limited. Edmund White isn't limited.
I just want to see as many voices as we can bring into the room. I'm, a straight gal from the suburbs of Massachusetts. I just want pretty sentences. I just want great voice on the page. That's really what I'm looking for. if stuff happens, great. But really, I need to start with pretty sentences. That's really, and to me, pretty sentences and voice obviously go hand in hand, but I just want someone to show me something new, right? Like, more world, please.
Well, I used to have a test that if you would read something, let's say you turn the page and you'd read the first sentence, and then you put your hand over the second sentence. If you could guess what it was, then that was a mistake. I mean, in other words, you should be constantly surprised and taken off guard by prose, I found.
Yeah, you want to feel that a writer's sort of sentences are adventures. You want to feel that a writer is as invested in the adventure of language as she is in the adventure of plot.
I want to stick with influences for a second. Obviously, I keep dropping names like Proust and Genet, and Garth, you just brought James Baldwin and Jeanette Winterson into the conversation as well. Both of you have, I don't want to say a debt to Henry James, but there is some Henry James lurking in the background of your work. And it's partially the interiority, right? Like, a novel is the perfect place to explore a character's interiority. It is, in fact, I think the only art form where we can really do that. I want to spend a little time on Henry James. He was a complex dude. Didn't necessarily live out loud, but I think pretty much accepted that everyone knew that he was gay. I guess? I don't know. I've never read a biography of James, so...
I don't think he was too comfortable with that.
Okay, so he just really ignored the whole... just pretended it wasn't happening.
There was a very attractive young English novelist who kind of came walking toward him with his arms open. And James said in his best English accent, I can't.
Oh.
And
okay.
I mean, I think that he certainly flirted with the gay subject matter constantly. Like, I did an anthology for Faber and Faber called the Faber Anthology of Gay Short Fiction. And I included in that The Pupil by Henry James, which is all about these impoverished but parents who want their son to have the best possible tutoring education, but they don't have any money, so they encourage the young Oxford tutor to fall in love with their son, so they won't have to pay the tutor. In the way, Hollinghurst adopted that idea too for his book.
Part of why I bring up Henry James, though, is when I think about his sentences, right? Like, this is not a guy who is concise. Both of you, and Edmund, Colm Tabin has said this about your sentences. It's kind of like, well, watching Edmund work is like being part of a conversation, right? That he's always moving somewhere, but then he surprises you, which is, I'm also paraphrasing Garth in a way. But there's a sort of clean line, and Garth, you do this too in your books, where there's this sort of very clean line with where you're going with the prose. And it is conversational, and you do feel very pulled in by the voice. Like, you are both very voicey writers, which I love. But yet I can't help but feel, here's Henry James in the background with his 3-paragraph long sentences doing a thing behind you. And Proust, same thing. I mean, these guys who would really write sentences, and legendarily, the first sentence of Tristram Shandy, right? Like, that's 4 pages long or something.
I see Garth as our Proust. But
okay, all right.
Because, I think in Proust there'll be a long section where somebody's just meditating on the nature. Swann is meditating on the nature of friendship, and all of a sudden, the Duc de Guermantes says to his wife, "You're wearing the wrong shoes." You're wearing, it'll have that kind of interplay between the factuality and drama of life, and then the kind of oversensitized nature of observation.
So story comes first,
or it's in a constant interplay with.
Okay.
With them.
Because that interplay that you just described to me, I mean, those are the moments that I like so much in Nocturnes as well, where you give us a moment where, our narrator is sliding out of a dinner party and he notices, and I'm not going to spoil it, but, he might notice what someone's wearing, and then he looks at the wall and sees the painting, and then he thinks, oh, but wait, we actually haven't had supper yet. And all of these things happen. And to me, that's where we get the story. The story comes out of that sort of collision of moments and detail, and I don't actually need anything to happen beyond the fact that we have a narrator who's moving through space and noticing things.
Right. Well, you're the ideal reader.
Yeah, I have a good time with these things. But I do want to talk about craft for a second, because it seems to me that both of you are working on a sentence level, that there's a little bit of it when you see it. And Edmund, especially when I look at the difference between Nocturnes for the King of Naples and Boy's Own Story, and I'm using those because you wrote them back to back. And so within a 5-year period, you create these two very distinct, very wonderful novels. And I'm kind of like, I'm doing the math going, okay, one writer, two very different worlds, but craft level. And Garth, your works, it does kind of sit in the same world, right? Am I correct in saying that? I mean, not just physically in Sofia, Bulgaria, but both books share sort of a Venn diagram, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both sort of emerging from the same world. They have overlapping time periods. Yeah, the new book sort of goes someplace different. It comes to America. But yeah, I'm attracted to writers whose sort of books are autonomous, well-made individual things, and then also sort of, feel like chapters in an unfolding project. That's attractive to me.
I think that's right. I agree with you. Another thing that we could mention, is the influence of music on our writing. Because, I mean, like Nocturnes for the King of Naples is the name of an actual piece of music by Haydn that he wrote for the King of Naples, who played an instrument that doesn't exist anymore called the lira organizzata. But so the idea of this king sitting down in Naples playing this strange bowed instrument attracted me. And then the Farewell Symphony is another composition by Haydn, where I think in real life the musicians were kind of on strike, and so they got Haydn to write a symphony where they would each leave the stage, and finally only one person would be playing on the stage to show the Esterhazy ruler that if he didn't fork up, that they would all leave. But that seemed to me like a really good metaphor about what was happening to the world with AIDS, that we were all sort of gradually leaving, and only one person was fiddling.
And Farewell Symphony is the third. You call them a trio of novels, and it's Boy's Own Story, Beautiful Room is Empty, and the Farewell Symphony, and you sort of wrote them over 12-year period. Do I have that? A 12 or 15-year period, but the three of them do sort of sit in concert together. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. But Garth, you started your training as an opera, your arts training started with opera singing, and then you moved to poetry. And I see that direct line. I see that absolute direct line. And then I see the direct line between poetry and prose, obviously. But can we talk about opera for a second, just in keeping with the music? Like, how do you decide that this is the thing you're going to do?
You mean how did I decide that?
Yeah, with opera, like, were you young? Like, were you a tiny person who just said, "This is the thing I want to do"? I'm just kind of fascinated by this because you're not particularly old.
It happened because I failed freshman English. So
okay.
in my public school in Kentucky, I failed freshman English. I needed extra credits. I thought the easiest option would be choir. And it just happened that at this Kentucky public school, the choir director was a very brilliant singer who heard something in my voice, started giving me voice lessons, gave me my first opera recordings, and also gave me tickets to my first opera. And that season at the Kentucky Opera, they performed Turn of the Screw. Benjamin Britten's
Oh.
adaptation of Henry James. So it's kind of like my whole artistic sort of trajectory was set when I was 14 and sat and listened to Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw.
I think you only have to listen to your speaking voice for 2 minutes to know that you're a trained singer.
Once upon a time. But I mean, definitely, I wouldn't start writing for a decade, but almost. But I mean, I do think, the kind of singing that I was trained in, sort of bel canto singing. I mean, one way to think about that is as an education in how stretching, because if you think of a bel canto aria, very often there are very few words stretched over a large amount of time. And it's a kind of training in how sort of suspending language in time can be productive of emotion. And I do think that the kinds of sentences I write, as much as they owe to a literary sort of tradition, which they owe a lot to, they also owe to that education in singing.
I had a very good friend in the 70s who called Simon Karlinsky, who was a composer, also the head of the Russian department at Berkeley. But he had been a composer, and he was the first and maybe the only reader of mine, who felt like my writing was musical and that it was constantly coming to. I mean, that chords were being resolved and all. It's things that I actually would think about, but nobody ever talks about.
Cadence matters. I think, especially because I'm someone who reads for language first. Cadence matters. I need a variety of sentence lengths. I need, sort of a dramatic pop somewhere on the page, right? I would like to not be able to predict where that dramatic pop is going to happen. That's even better when I can just be surprised. Hopefully, there is a musicality inherent in any kind of writing, right? Like if you think about it. And even if you go back to a sonnet, right?
Yeah.
14 lines, you can do a lot in those 14 lines, but it needs to be read aloud in order to really get the pop of the thing, right?
Garth, when you teach creative writing, do you encourage your writers to vary sentence length and grammatical structure? I mean, will you say to them, there are too many subject, verb, objects, sentences of the same length?
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, and we spend a lot of time sort of, because I find, it was my experience in workshop as a student that people would sometimes mention style, but they had no idea what actually style was or how to talk about it or how to like say something concrete about it as opposed to these really vague things. And so like stylistic analysis, which involves looking at syntax, looking at grammar. I mean, in fact, in my graduate seminar at NYU, at the students' request this past semester, I dragged out all of my grammar handouts from when I taught sophomore English in high school, because, I realized as we were trying to look at sentences that sort of verb, object, subject, verb, object, a lot of us were not on the same page in the room. But I think it's really helpful to sort of have those kinds of tools to be able to look, because then you can see that, right, if you have a lot of sentences back to back that are constructed in the same way, that's going to be kind of clogging. Yeah.
It gets a little relentless.
I blame computers too, because I think like I remember once when I was living in Paris is when journalists began to write with computers. And I asked my editor at the Herald Tribune, I said, well, what effect does it have? And he said, all the goddamn sentences that are the same length, the same structure, and they just fall into this monotonous rhythm, which they didn't do when they were writing by hand or on the proper typewriter.
Edmund, I mean, your career has sort of carried you across that technological transformation. I know you, right? At least I think I'm right that you write on the computer now.
Yeah.
But I assume, I mean, when you started, did you write fiction on the typewriter? Did you write it longhand? And what is that transition?
Longhand. And I really like writing longhand because I think like Nocturnes is a longhand novel.
It feels that way.
You're constantly fiddling with sentence lengths, but also even stylistic differences. Like I was reading Nocturnes for the first time in many years today, and I was surprised to see there was a kind of parody of Cavalcanti, Donna Mi Prega. A lady asked me what is love, and that's something that Ezra Pound did a parody of. It's a very strange piece of poetry because the lady asks him what is love, but he doesn't really like love very much, and he has a lot of hostile views about it. I wrote a sonnet, which I write out as prose so nobody suspects it. Only James Merrill ever figured out that that was a sonnet. I also, in this book, have a sestina. I have a sestina which I write out as prose, so nobody ever would see it. And I have couplets here and there. But it was just to keep myself awake while I was writing. I enjoyed that kind of playing with form, and of course, I'm always echoing religious writers of the early Middle Ages, like Saint Gregory of Nyssa.
All right, so we've got music, we've got form, and I'm going to include poetry sort of under form. But both of you have lived overseas for pretty significant amounts of time and not necessarily spoken English regularly while you were there. And Garth, I'm totally fascinated by Bulgarian, and Edmund, of course, your French is, I'm sure, far, far better than mine. But the reason I bring that up is the idea that you do have to switch gears, right, pretty significantly when you're speaking in a foreign language and thinking in a foreign language and living outside of English. And it's a really wild liminal space to be in. And I do think it sort of changes your approach to prose. And I'm just wondering if you guys would riff on that a little bit, because I think that's part of both of your books.
Well, I mean, I think Nocturnes, although I wrote it in America, I was already a great Francophile, and I wrote it. And I think that it's a kind of poetic prose that people don't really like in English, but that is quite acceptable in French. I remember Calvino's wife saying to me once, "Oh, I don't like this book, Nocturnes. It's awful. But because you're so always so poetic and sentimental, and you're not that kind of person."
Okay, I wasn't expecting Mrs. Calvino to quite have.
This is what's wonderful about Edmund's conversation. Like all of a sudden, Calvino comes in from the wing. Really an amazing experience to talk with Edmund White.
Well, she was, Argentine and very short and kind of forceful as a person.
So before we go, though, Garth, you have a new novel coming in the fall of 2024, which we are taping this well in advance of the next book. But can we get a little preview of Small Rain? Because I love the idea, and you hinted a little bit at what's going on, and I have read a tiny bit of it. I have not yet finished it because I don't want it to end. But I'd love to have you set it up for listeners.
Sure. So this novel coming out September 3rd called Small Rain. And it begins with the narrator, who is the same narrator as the first two books, but now living in the United States in Iowa City, a Midwestern college town, with his partner in a house that they own. So a very different kind of situation. He is sort of struck down by a very scary, kind of mysterious medical crisis. And so it's a book about someone sort of decades before he had thought he would have to, sort of looking at his life and asking the question, if this is it, sort of what has it meant? And his life has been one sort of dedicated to art, to poetry, and to music. And I guess it's a book about sort of where the value of a life comes. So it's about a kind of medical crisis. Yeah.
How does it fit in chronologically with the other two books?
So it's after. So he has returned from Bulgaria, and I mean it's about 7 years after, because Cleanness ends with the narrator sort of saying he's going back to the United States, and he's been in the United States about 7 years.
Edmund, can I ask, are you working on anything new? I sort of feel like you're always working on something new, but
Well, I'm writing poetry, which
okay.
I have almost a volume, maybe in another year I'll have a volume. I've written a sex memoir called The Loves of My Life, which is coming out in January, Bloomsbury.
Okay.
And then I've also finished a novel. All this terrible COVID writing. I finished a novel called The Spirit Lamp, and which is about my nephew. And now I'm writing a novel, which is I don't know if I'll live long enough to write it. I call it my posthumous novel.
Well, it just sounds like we get a lot more of you, which I'm pretty excited about because, like I said, I've been reading you for more than a minute, and I'm very excited to have new work. And I'm very excited to have Small Rain, Garth's new novel, in the fall. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Edmund White, Garth Greenwell, it was so much fun to hang out with you. And Nocturnes for the King of Naples is out now, and it's gorgeous, and everyone should read it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.